Welcome to the Facts versus Feelings podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Detrick, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sonu Varghese.
Cutting through the noise in 30 minutes each week with Ryan Detrick, Chief Market Strategist, and Sonu Varghese, VP Global Macro Strategist, taking out the boring and helping investors focus on what really matters. A quick note before we start the show. Investment advisory services offered through CWM LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. Carson Partners, a division of CWM LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a really special edition of Carson's Facts versus Feelings with Ryan and Sonu. Sonu, this is episode 61. Amazing how time flies when you're having fun. We have a very, very special guest. We're joined by Claudia Sahm, and we're titling this one, episode 51, talking about the Sahm Rule and unemployment with Claudia Sahm. I mean, at the end of the day, let's just talk to the person who made the rule, right, Sonu?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, we're very excited about this. The Sahm Rule, I mean, we just talked, Claudia, we were talking to you before this. Your phone's been ringing off the hook, literally since the payroll report came out. But, one thing I've been excited about, Ryan, talking to Claudia over here on the Facts vs. Feelings podcast is, look, she's at the intersection of so much of what we talk about, the Fed, the economy, inflation, fiscal policy. Claudia's been an economist at the Fed. She's advised the board there, advised Congress, White House. She writes for Bloomberg. She has her own newsletter, which I realized only a while ago. I've been a subscriber for a while. It's called Stay at Home Macro, which, the acronym is SAM, right? But anyway, I highly recommend that. No, thank you for being here, Claudia.
Thank you for having me.
This is a ton of stuff we want to talk about, Claudia, but the first things first, by the time people listen to this, we are recording it Friday before Thanksgiving. What do you plan on eating to celebrate Thanksgiving next week? How does your family, how much do you eat?
Yeah. So my husband's brother always hosts the Thanksgiving, and he is an amazing cook, and there will be an amazing amount of food. So I very much look forward to it.
That's good. Sonu, where you're going, by the way? You want to mention where you're headed next week?
Well, by the time this comes out, I will be in the Caribbean in Jamaica, so for a vacation. So I'm very excited about that. I haven't taken a vacation for almost a year now, so it's about time, I guess. And I've never been there, so look, hopefully this time, by the time the podcast comes out, we'll be sitting with one of those drinks with an umbrella in it or something. So, what about you? What's the plan? What pie do you like, Ryan?
Yeah, I'll eat a lot, I'm sure. I'll just eat the standard things. I mean, pecan pie is a good one. Of course, pumpkin, I mean, who can pick a favorite? So just try them all, I guess, is the way to put it. But Claudia, let's just kind of get into it if you want. This will hopefully be fun. We'll go all over the place, but let's just start with your rule. Can we call it your rule? When did you come up with the Sahm Rule? And you were giving us a little insight. Not everyone on X/Twitter agrees with your own rule. You want to tell us a few funny stories about people getting angry with you?
Yeah, well, we'll start with the origin story of the Sahm Rule. I developed it for a volume that was put out by the Brookings Institution and Washington Center for Equitable Growth. It was called Recession Ready, and all of the chapters, and I contributed one, were on how can we have more automatic stabilizers. So more policies that are tied to economic conditions that hit go as soon as we are in a recession. Take the politics out of it, put them on autopilot, let Congress deal with whatever is new in the recession. So I wrote a piece on sending out stimulus checks or direct payments to people automatically. I've done a lot of research at the Fed and a lot of policy work on what's the best way to help households in a recession, and looking at the experience after the Great Recession, the best, according to my research, was send out the checks. Let people do what they need to do with the money. And so the Sahm Rule, which did not have that name in the piece, it was just a recession indicator. The Sahm Rule was really a supporting actor to this process. And it turns out, and people were impressed by the fact that it's highly accurate. I mean, it's every single recession since the 1970s. It is triggered early in the recession, and it has not triggered outside of a recession. And if you go back all the way to after World War II, it has very few false positives. Like this thing works, and there's a logic to it, and we'll probably talk about that some. So, and it's not a forecast of a recession. It's an indicator. Are we in a recession? Big picture right now, we are not in a recession, right? It's moved. It's got, as the unemployment rate has moved up, that makes any recession indicator, including mine, it's more worrisome. But this indicator has not triggered. We are not in a recession. Okay, so what is this thing? What's the Sahm rule? So it's very simple by design. Again, this was supposed to be something written into legislation by Congress. So you can't have some regime switching factor model, type thing. So it's very simple. It takes the national unemployment rate. It then takes a 3-month moving average, going back the whole series. That's important because we don't want to overreact to a bump and wiggle in the monthly unemployment or just how things move around. And then we compare the most recent value of that 3-month average to the lowest value of the 3-month average over the prior 12 months. If that difference is a half a percentage point or more, we are in a recession. At least that's been the historical pattern. I don't want to say the Sahm rule doesn't cause a recession. It's just trying to, this is a pattern we've seen in the past, and so this trigger is a half a percentage point. Right now we're at 0.3 percentage point. So we're getting closer. It was about 0 in the middle of the year. So it's not a good sign. And yet at 0.3 percentage point, that has happened before without a recession. So it's not, and this time is quite different in terms of what's happening and why the unemployment rate is rising.
Maybe you can talk about that because, rising, ultimately, I think the Sahm rule nicely gets to the fact that, we have so many macroeconomic indicators there, but, maybe the best one is the unemployment rate, right? If more people are getting laid off and, that impacts spending and the economy goes into a recession, broad-based, right? Decline across the board. So how worried should we be about the fact that the unemployment rate has gone from 3.5% to 3.9%? And maybe, you wrote about, quote unquote, why this time could be different, right? Very dangerous words to say, but I thought you had a really nice piece on that recently.
Well, thank you. We have to look under the hood, right? So before I explain why this time could be different with the Sahm rule, I think it's worth showing or pointing out this time was different with another big recession indicator. Often we will look to 2 consecutive quarters of declines in real GDP as a recession, right? I don't use that. I use the Sahm rule instead because it takes a while to get 2 quarters of GDP data, right? So, but that has only happened within recessions in the United States. You have to go all the way back to 1947, and there's like kind of this, it hits there. But every single time, not outside of, right? And so we had 2 quarters of declines in GDP last year, and we didn't have a recession. Now, if you're like, okay, but this wasn't just some like, oh, how did this happen? It was some fluky thing. If you look under the hood, it totally makes sense given that we've been coming out of the pandemic and all its disruptions. One of the quarters, there was a big drag from net exports. Again, we're working out all the supply chain stuff, the trade pieces. And the other quarter was from inventory investment. That was the drag. Again, business have had a really hard time trying to figure out how much to have and when to have it and all that stuff. And again, supply chains. So it totally makes sense that was, and if you looked in those 2 periods, and I was adamant that we were not in a recession then, it's like consumer spending is growing, we still had business investment growing outside, the fixed investment. They look great, but it's hard. We grab these indicators like the GDP growth, and I get it. I mean, the one night I was sitting watching TV, I look at my phone, and Cardi B is tweeting out that we're in a recession, and I'm like, there goes tomorrow with my press. Like, and I got a lot of press calls the next day. It's kind of rough being an expert on recessions. Again, when I wrote the volume, I wanted to be, and I am, an expert on how do you help people in recessions. Basically, no one asked me right now, if we go in a recession, what should we do? But I get a lot of like, are we in a recession? But whatever, I'm here to be helpful, and it's okay. So a very similar theme is what I talk about with the Sahm rule and why this time could be different. We have seen a lot of mismatches in like the supply of workers, how many people are looking for jobs, and how many workers employers are looking for. So last year we had, and going into this year, labor shortages. Like we want to hire, there aren't enough workers. And that, I mean, that caused a lot of disruptions. We've heard a lot about labor shortages. Well, we go into this year and we've had a burst of workers coming back. Like the labor force participation rate on net, kind of looking over the year, has come up. And some of it is, I don't want to use the word transitory. Some of it are things that happen that we don't expect to last. A really good example of this, we had a large number of immigrants who had work visas but weren't processed during the pandemic. So they were brought in. Now, many of them were going straight to jobs. So, there's some mismatch. But I mean, that was a burst of people coming in. We have also seen historic levels of women's employment,
Right.
Black men's employment, disabled. I mean, like you name, and a lot of that really started getting going this year. So now we're in this situation where we have the jobs trying to catch up with the workers. Right? There's more work. Whereas last year we had, uh, actually I'm getting it all wrong, but I mean you get the idea. Like we just had
Right.
this mismatch, and so now like there's more people showed up, and it takes some time for them. It's a good thing that we have more workers back, but it's going to take some time for them to find jobs, and in the interim, the unemployment rate is going to drift up. And as with everything in this recovery, it just takes so long to work through disruption. So I am fully prepared emotionally for the Sahm Rule to trigger. It would have to get up to 4% and hang around there for 3 months, or some months go a little above it. Like it can't stay where it is right now at 3.9 and trigger. Uh, and yet, like we're not that far from it, and it wouldn't take that long to hang around 4%, and it would trigger. And yet, if it really is largely or in good part about the supply, those jobs will catch up. We're still adding a good number of jobs every month. It's just the workers got back in faster this year. So that's the story of the Sahm Rule could trigger. We hang around 4%. We maybe go back down. That is not a recession. In a recession, the Sahm Rule will trigger the mildest of recessions. It rises 2 percentage points from its low. And in most recessions, it's closer to 4. And so going up and being like 4.2 for a while, that's not recessionary. Now, normally this gets going because it's unemployment is rising because of demand slowing. And that's in there certainly, but if it's really demand, this time ain't gonna be different, right? Because it'll get that feedback loop
Sure.
going. But we'll see.
Well, very interesting. A couple things came in my mind there. You mentioned, like, what you do, right? The government work and the Fed. Sono and I have talked a lot about the private data on rents, apartment lists, and Zillow, how year over year that's been coming down significantly. We're finally, after like a year, starting to see it in the government's work. I've always wondered, we make jokes, our friends in the government, why is the government's work so delayed versus what the private data, at least as it pertains to these rent prices? Why does it take so long for the government to see what's happening in real time? I'd love to know this.
There are conceptual differences,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay, so the rent data that show up month to month, those are what you call the spot prices. Right?
Okay.
That's like if I go out and get an apartment right now, it would be less of an increase, in some cases a decrease, from what if I went out last month or last year. Okay, so but in the consumer price index or in the personal consumption expenditure index that the Fed uses, or CPI gets a lot more attention in general, the concept is not if a consumer were to go out now and rent an apartment, it's of all the consumers, how much are they paying rent? Right? So you've got this, like the spot price will move a lot faster than this kind of group of households. And so, but the thing is we know it's coming,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you
Right.
see it, and
Right.
the Fed, in part, that's why they developed this super core. I mean, as soon as super core looks better, they'll have super duper core. They'll keep finding the most worrisome parts of inflation. It's the Fed. But the reason they have this super core is very specific to this current situation with the rents, because or super core, I should define it. It's core services, so nothing energy, and then it's nothing energy or related to food. So it's core services, and then you take out shelter, right? Because they know that the shelter, and normally they wouldn't do this, right? Like this is a little slicing and dicing that you don't usually see the Fed do. And so because they know that those rents are coming in. So it's not like in the measured data, there's a reason why the CPI is measured the way it is, whether it's the rent costs the way they go in or the owner equivalent rents, which is this whole other beast. So they measure it a certain way, but policymakers understand
Mm-hmm.
that there's this disconnect, and there are some researchers at the Federal Reserve, I forget which of the banks, who have done actually this calculation of how should this move through. Because the statistical agencies are very transparent about how they do their measurements. I mean, it's really hard to sometimes mimic it because they're very like detailed. So yeah, but that this shelter inflation has been the biggest chunk of CPI for a very long time, and it's kind of hard to convince people. Yeah, it's coming down, and frankly, it hasn't for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's
Okay.
and we had, I should say, we got in this week, I guess when this airs, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, we got the latest consumer price index reading for October,
Mm-hmm.
which was very encouraging. I was so happy. I was on a TV show right when it came out. I was like, yes. And they're like, you're happy. And I'm like,
Something
oh,
to
yeah,
be
I'm happy.
thankful about.
But the month,
There you go.
yeah, I was like, my Thanksgiving. The month before it, the shelter price inflate, like it didn't continue its march down. And there was some real concerns that it actually wasn't going to pull through in the way, because the Zillow and like these are
Mm-hmm.
inputs that don't necessarily like it's the
Okay.
representative and whatever. So no, it's been definitely a piece to watch, and the housing
Okay.
market in general has just been a lot
Okay.
going on.
We've hit about the halfway point, so I want to go one more here. Where I saw you went to Denison University in Ohio. Can I ask where you grew up?
Yeah, I grew up in Indiana on a hog farm. So
Okay.
Wow.
not too far. I, grew up in Indiana. I did undergrad in Ohio, and my PhD
Mhm.
is from University of Michigan.
So
Oh,
the
ouch.
University of Denison, I would think you are one of the more famous people to graduate from there, right? We've got what, Steve Carell, Jennifer Gardner, and yourself, right? Who else? Anybody else from Denison? I mean, we're in royalty here.
There's some
A
more.
few more,
I
yeah.
think
It's
Michael
got to be.
Eisner. There's some
Oh,
business
I think you're
people
right. Yeah.
that are
Okay.
Denison. So
So
yeah,
go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, if recent dorky econ people, I think I've done a good job. um, there's they've sent people. There's a really good economist at the Cleveland Fed who is a little bit around my time, but
Mhm.
yeah, no, and it's been exciting and it's nice. I was on NPR last week, and one of my professor who taught me intermediate macro
Mhm.
sent me a really nice email. It's like, oh, I heard you on the thing, and my undergrad advisor called me this week because he had read about the Sahm Rule in the Economist. So
Mhm.
I certainly, and he was the one, and I tell him when I talk to him, I was like, I blame you for this. In intro, he convinced me, and this was absolutely a theme throughout my college experience, that economists can do good in the world. And I've met some economists. I'm not sure they're doing good in the world, but I try. And working in policy has been the path that, at least for me, I find the most direct to try at least to do good.
Well, just so the listeners know, Denison is in Ohio. I'm from Ohio. I've had a friend go there, and I've been there a couple times. It's what, to the
Mhm.
east of Columbus, I guess. So,
Mhm.
anyway, so all right, Sonu, go ahead. Just wanted to have a little fun personal one there. Yeah.
No, speaking of economists, right? Claudia, most economists, at least last year, thought we needed unemployment to go up for inflation to fall, right? I mean, you had folks like Larry Summers, very famous economist there, saying we needed mass unemployment to curb inflation. Now, what's ironic here is for most of us, strong wage growth and low unemployment is a good thing, but obviously for a lot of economists, and probably even at the Fed, they think of it as a bad thing. Too much growth is bad, right? But luckily for all of us, inflation pulled back a lot over the last year from 9% to about just over 3% in October. What's interesting, you just talked about shelter, right? This morning I was looking at CPI, Consumer Price Index, excluding shelter, that's running at 1.5%, right? You think about what are a lot of homeowners, at least, not about people are renting and who are looking for new rentals. It's 1.5% inflation, whether you look at the last 12 months, last 3 months, last 6 months, right? So, and at the same time, economic growth has accelerated 2.9% over the last year. Unemployment rate, yes, it's gone up, but it's still under 4%. That's good. What did the economists get wrong? And you were not in that camp. I want to add that as well.
Well, there's enough wrongness to go around. So I'll say what a lot of my peers got wrong, and then I'll say what I got wrong. Many of the economists, the commentary moved too fast away from what COVID did. Right? And I underestimated how severe this was. We have to remember we shut down a 25 trillion plus economy in the United States like within weeks. Right? We shut it down, and as it turns out, throwing it back into gear is both harder and slower than we expected. And you get a lot of these, like with the labor market, a mismatch. Like not everything just goes back together. And frankly, this was a global pandemic, the disruptions in global supply. I mean, we hear about this largely with supply chains and goods. It was a mess everywhere. And we had no control over how other countries dealt with the pandemic. I mean, China stayed in shutdown for a very long time. That had an effect on the US economy. So the fact that this was a very, we haven't seen this in generations, a supply shocks. Like this wasn't just oil and energy. We had that too with Russia invading Ukraine, but this disruption of supply chains, disruption of labor markets in supply, this has not happened. This is not something in the economic models. Supply was really downplayed. The infamous Phillips curve was marched out to make these big predictions about how much unemployment it would take. And basically big picture, those are just about demand, right? Like you have to get inflation down. If you assume inflation is coming from too much demand, you need to get demand down. Well, a good way to get demand down in the United States is to have people lose their paychecks, right? And that shows up in unemployment. So it's not, or have less paychecks. But that conceptually, and this is well known in economics, that conceptually only works when it's demand. If you get into supply, you have to move away from the very simple Phillips curve. Like you can kind of do it, but again, we haven't seen these non-energy supply shocks. So this like missing supply, trying to pretend COVID didn't happen, saying it was all demand. It was partly demand, but it just. I mean, I really was pulling my hair out, sometimes in not the most professional way. So the thing that I got wrong, and then there were plenty of people, really smart real world economists that I hang out with, who got this right. That this was, and the Fed talked about transitory, and it was just longer transitory, which was the mistake that I made and many of these peers. It took so long. Like I had no understanding, and I think frankly I hadn't thought a lot about supply and all the pieces to the puzzle. And it took a long time, at least an extra year, to get, in each. It took 2 years for the supply chains to get sorted out. A lot of us thought, and I thought, a year. Like they'll build it, they'll catch up with demand. They just couldn't. And then, the labor market is still disrupted. So that's the piece that we should be learning, but it frustrates me. Some of my peers will look at this year and call it immaculate disinflation. Okay, so there's nothing immaculate about a deadly pandemic. On the other side of it, economists, this is why we're not allowed to write Hallmark cards. We're not very good with words. But if you say it's immaculate, you're saying we don't know what it was. Right. And it's like, no, we know exactly what that was, or at least a good chunk of it. It's just, it wasn't what the Phillips curve told us, and thus it is immaculate. And it's like, oh, come on. But we'll get there. I mean, macro will sort this out largely.
So I do want to say one thing. You mentioned you weren't totally professional at one time pulling your hair out. If you were 100% professional, we would have never invited you to our podcast. We don't want that. We like to have real world people who understand things. So we've kind of hinted around it. I mean, let's talk about the Fed for a minute if we can. I mean, I'll just be blunt about it, is the Fed done hiking, and when could they cut? Or how do you see things playing out into 2024 with Fed policy here?
They're done hiking unless something unforeseen happens. I mean, we've had a run of really bad luck. So, yeah, I like to say the asteroid would be inflationary. So but we're on a path, and particularly we've gotten good news, and we've gotten good news this year, and they have slowed down, and they had some pauses. So it's completely within. There's no way they're raising in December, right? Like and even the most hawkish members of the FOMC are sounding pretty dovish. And at that point, it's like, okay, we're done hiking. Now, I don't expect them to cut anytime soon. I think some of the markets, people that have, like the investment banks with the forecast shops, the ones that have cuts starting in the spring or honestly in the first half, those have got to at this point be based on a recession or some real weakening in the economy. I'm very much closer to like Goldman has been throughout this no recession, no recession. I mean, and they're a really good shop. But that means that they have cuts coming way late in the year. As long as demand holds up and you hear messaging from the Fed, it's like, oh, we got to be really sure, and oh, we don't want it to come back. And um, I think they'll be really slow. If the economy holds up, I think they'll be very slow to cut. I think that's a mistake, but I think they'll be very slow to cut. And what for the people that expect the cuts early in a recession, they ain't cutting in a recession. I mean, at least not early in a recession. The Fed has been very focused on the experiences in the 1970s. One of the lessons from the Arthur Burns Fed, one of the mistakes that is kind of pinned on him, is that when unemployment started to rise, the Fed cut. And then when they came out of the recession, inflation came back even more. Now, the 1970s were very different from now, but that, like, nobody wants to be Arthur Burns, right? So that looms really large in the psychology of the Fed. So unemployment starts rising, they're not going to cut. I'm hopeful. At the last FOMC meeting, I was somewhat disappointed that at one point Chair Powell was asked something about the cuts. I mean, very similar to what you had, like when could this happen? And he's just like, we're not even thinking about that. We're not even talking about that. It's basically like, do we raise more or do we not? And it's like, are you kidding me? You're not even talking about that. Like you should be thinking. I mean, I think they've got to be talking about it inside the building. But this is like, no, you should be. And that actual like we're not going to talk about it. I think that's one of the reasons you look across the investment banks and there's massive differences in the forecast of when the cuts come. And that just shows that there's confusion, and that's on the Fed. And the world too. I don't want to blame them for everything. So I think the cuts will come later, but I don't expect Congress or the Fed to step up if we go into a recession, particularly early in the recession. And if you don't act early in the recession, it's going to be worse than it has to because the loops get going.
So, speaking of the Fed, and your background is in the Fed, and maybe you can talk. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you did at the Fed, like even your day to day, and what it was like advising folks like Chair Powell and everyone on the FOMC committee.
I started at the Federal Reserve in the summer of 2007 as one of the leads on consumer spending. So one can imagine that my first year, and frankly, the financial crisis and the Great Recession, that was awful. And I mean, I was really learning how to do my job. I worked on the staff forecast and had amazing people to learn from, had a ton of support. But I mean, honestly, I was just like, what am I doing here? Right? Like, this is not, I'm brand new. Honestly, though, I found the recovery harder. I mean, I was getting better at the forecasting, to look at the date, but in the sense of looking out at the world and being like, wow, we really did a lot of damage to families. And that recovery, unlike this recovery, which just came roaring back, very different recession, but I mean, there's a lot of reasons. But the recovery from the Great Recession was slow and very painful. And watching that as someone who'd look at all the data and put the pieces together and tell the story, and then also give some pushback on the overall forecast to be like, it's not coming back that fast. And then that was one where being right was really miserable because you keep seeing like it's just not coming back. Now the recovery did come right before the pandemic. We were seeing wage growth that was solid, low unemployment. So it's not that we didn't get to a good place. It's just it does a lot of damage if it takes a long time. And that's why I was very aggressive in advising on fiscal policy in the COVID recession and in 2021 because I don't ever want us to see that again after the Great Reset. Like that was bad. Now we got inflation this time, but that largely was coming from supply. The demand was in there, but on net, the good that we see in the labor market and household finances, in paychecks, consumer spending, inflation adjusted, I fully believe in the data back me up that on net that was the big push to get us out of the recession was worth it. But anyways, I digress from my time at the Fed. So I worked 10 years on the staff forecast. Within that, I spent a year at the White House as a senior economist. This was the very end of the Obama administration. That was when I truly became a macro generalist because I covered the entire U.S. economy and the housing market. That's like hundreds of economists at the Fed. So that was really good, a good experience. Then I left. I guess I developed the Sahm Rule, or it was named after me, but I had my automatic stabilizers. That volume came out in 2019. I was asked later in the year to give congressional testimony on automatic stabilizers, and there is no way that a Fed economist is going to give testimony on automatic stabilizers. So at that point, I talked to a friend who works in the policy space, and I said, I want to work on fiscal policy. And so then I left. Towards the end of 2019, I had started advising some members of Congress who were looking at ways to put more of the enhancements of jobless benefits on autopilot. There's some draft legislation with the Sahm Rule in it. And then, like, not even months later, COVID hit. I was like, what is that? Once again, as new out in the fiscal world, I'm going through this crisis. But this time I was ready and had the expertise to really be a part of that process.
Well, Claudia, this has been great. I think we've got time for probably 2 more questions. I'll go with one, and then Sonu can finish things up. This is episode 61 of Carson's Facts versus Feelings, talking the Sahm Rule and unemployment with Claudia Sahm. So, Claudia, you mentioned timing, and I always think of this when you talk about like good times and bad times. I think one of the greatest handoffs ever, and this kind of links to the Fed, was when Volcker said, you're it to Greenspan in August of 87 when the market was up 500% off the lows, 40% for the year. He might have known there was some trouble coming. He said, let the new guy handle it. And we all know what happened in 87 with that handoff. So good job, Paul Volcker, getting out of the way ahead of that one. But I always like to ask this one. This is kind of I think a neat one. It's a little different. Tell me, so we've got a lot of financial advisors that listen to this. Now, I know you're macro strategist, economy. Maybe, some theme you've learned from investing or the economy, some little tidbit, that's not even a word. tidbit of, it's Friday afternoon, believe me. It's been a long week. We talked about that before we started, but a long week. Anyway, some little wisdom for the listeners. And then also maybe one mentor, someone you really look up to, you learn from over your career. Those 2 things, please.
Yeah. So in terms of what kind of investment advice should I think about? Like more personal, or like
whatever you want, honestly. Yeah, I mean, maybe like buy and hold, kind of big picture stuff, probably. Not so much short-term trading, but big buy and hold, or whatever you think's interesting, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. A development in the economy, like we're very focused on like right now, like is inflation coming down and all this stuff. One development that is maybe picking up some speed that I think for someone thinking about investments, particularly long-term investments, it would be worth pondering. We have seen recently some encouraging pickup in productivity growth. And that's something
I'm watching Sonu's face right now. He's starting to smile. He's
yeah. And the productivity is just like wildly difficult to measure, and it takes really a good bit of time to say with any confidence, oh no, that looks like it's really there. And sometimes by the time you think it's really there, it's gone. But it's that I mean, that's the holy grail of economic prosperity, is to get the US economy moving. And there's a big conversation about what's the neutral interest rate and the long term, which has all kinds of repercussions like throughout financial markets. Well, if we really get some more productivity and we get some more growth, well, those interest rates, like we, in some sense, they should stay up, right? Because it's supporting a more robust economy. We And there's also been a big discussion about when we come out of this, after we rebalanced, are we back like pre-pandemic? Like what looks like pre-pandemic and what looks different? We are on a track, particularly if the productivity growth holds up, we're on a track that we're going to look back to that period after the Great Recession up to the pandemic and say that was the aberration. That was the unusual thing. So it's important, in my view, it's important to kind of look out ahead and play out scenarios in the long term and not, it just leaves think about like how much those could be different from where we came before the pandemic. For a lot of things, we could go back to very much the pandemic. I've been adamant about, unless we see some structural changes, there's no reason, like once we rebalance, you should expect something kind of like before the pandemic, but something like productivity growth. And we have some technologies, that get a lot of attention, AI and all that, and that's real. But we've also seen people come off the sidelines, groups of workers who haven't been there before. And we could really move this economy. And so that's obviously, I mean, that's the context. And again, as a macroeconomist, I try to contextualize in my investment advice, because otherwise I'd just tell you mutual funds. Anyways, yeah, in terms of a mentor, I have been really blessed with lots of different people who have invested in my career and been encouraging. Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard to pick. But I do think the professor I mentioned at the beginning, Saurabh Bedad, who I get to talk to this week, I wouldn't be an economist if it weren't for him, right? Because I didn't know what an economist was when I got to undergrad. So that's someone that sent me on the path and has been. He just has amazing timing of when to call me. I mean, obviously, he saw it in The Economist and it was all like happy. But I can remember in like 21, like I was having a horrible time. And he just out of the blue called me and he's like, "Hey, I'm rooting for you. You're right, they're wrong." Yeah. So yeah, that's what you need, is someone to mentor and then also kind of check back in and make sure you're still in a good place. So yeah.
Well, that was great. Did we lose Sonu? Is he no longer there? I think we might have lost Sonu, and that's okay. That's okay. We're not going to stop the show now. I'll tell you that much. I'll put on my best Sonu hat for my final question here as we wrap things up. Hopefully, Sonu approves of my final question. What could, and maybe you've hinted at some of this, but let's just put a bow on it. What could be the biggest macroeconomic surprise you think next year in 2024 that maybe no one's talking about?
Oh my gosh, I'm doing good if I can forecast 6 weeks out.
Tell me about it. Yeah, I know.
So next year, I think we the rebalancing of the economy is really picking up steam. We could easily be back closer to 2% than a lot of people think we will. In some ways, I've been out of consensus in, I think this is temporary. I think we'll get back on track and rebalancing. For those who have disagreed with that or still think, the temporary, inflation coming down is largely gone, and then we're going to get stuck and we're going to go with 3%. And then we have to talk about 3% target instead of 2% target, and blah, blah, blah. I think they're going to be wrong. I mean, I've thought that for a while, and we won't. I mean, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take several more months of encouraging data on inflation. Not every month is going to be encouraging, and yet if we get there and we got the momentum, and I think we will, barring some other unforeseen event, then that's really good. And then we got to step back and like I think there's going to be a lot of post-processing of the surprises since the pandemic. And we absolutely have to do that. And we're on a path to do it. But we got to get things back to some semblance of normal.
Right. Well, Sonu, it looks like you came back. You left
Yes,
us for a minute, Sonu.
I
I
have
asked
no
the
idea.
what? Yeah, well, whatever. I asked what did I ask? Oh, potential surprise. Sonu, maybe one more time. You want to do one more question? I knew we were kind of at the end here, but I want you to ask one more, and then we'll sign off here.
Yeah, I was just curious. You know what? We'll wrap it up because I know this has been a popular question or topic of conversation. Why is sentiment so poor? Why, it seems like the economy is doing fine, but everyone feels like, we're in a recession. Is it the media? I have no idea. It's just a puzzle. I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
I am puzzled too. I've spent a lot of time on this, and I will, as background, say when I worked on consumer spending at the Fed, I mean, really was the expert on the sentiment, the Michigan survey, the different measures. People before the Great Recession, they called it sooner than the economists did, right? Because it really started to go south. In the end of 2007. Okay, so I have a lot, and I've spent a lot of time researching with that data. So I have an immense amount of respect for that survey, and I think it's one of our few channels of macro where we go to people and ask them, what do you expect? How are things doing? And we bring it into our work. And yet, after having looked at this from lots of different angles, as far as I'm concerned, the wheels have come off the bus on these, the Michigan survey, other surveys. And not to say that I would never tell people how to feel. This is marriage counseling 101. We do not tell people how to feel. We respect their feelings. And yet, these are not, as an economist, I want to focus on the economics. Like how are people doing? Not how do they feel about how they're doing. And because that's my lane. And if I'm helping to help design good economic policy, I'm not a politician. I really hate politics, but I need to have a grounding in reality for evaluating policy and then giving advice on future policy. Okay, so teasing apart what's under the hood with sentiment. Like I want to take the non-economic and pull it out and focus on the economic. There's always something going on under the hood. It's just it, um like I said, wheels coming off the bus. And one, to like people are like, oh, well, inflation is high and gloomy. And I'm like, okay, I get it. Like people should be gloomy. Inflation is high. Now inflation has come down. But I mean, I get it. People should be gloomy. But if you look at the historical patterns, they're gloomier, right? Like they're almost as gloomy as the 1970s. And we had high inflation, much higher inflation and high unemployment, right? Like it just doesn't, like something else is going on there. I've written 2 Bloomberg opinion pieces on this Substack post. I've got another one I'm working on today. One is you see a disconnect come in about the time COVID showed up. So I think there's something about the pandemic. If that's the case, it will dissipate over time, right? And it's across groups. You can always see like if you ask people their political affiliation, there are strong differences in just like anything in sentiment, maybe a little less their personal finances, but just in general. And when the person in the presidency, the parties, they flip, right? So there's clearly, but I mean, the United States is pretty equally divided on politics, so it doesn't affect the total, right? But the total moved when pandemic came in, and it's not just the virus; it's like all the things that happen, the disruptions. Okay, so but then it's still like, and I had a lot of people was like, well, what else could be going on? And the last piece I wrote was on the hypothesis of it was there's bad things in the world, right? Like we've legit had a lot of bad things. The media amplifies bad. I mean, people gravitate to the bad. I mean, they're feeding their audience. If it bleeds, it leads. I mean, this is nothing new. Okay, but the third piece that has been newer in the last, not just COVID, but in years before, is social media. So we now have a technology that can amplify far and wide and fast. And sometimes it's just from regular people. So it's more personal. And yeah. And then I've been basically fighting with bots on X. So like and actually I should say this anger and people manipulating technology to make it, that's not just on Twitter, right? You see that on all the social media platforms. And if you ask people where they get their news from, right? Like this is a bigger thing. So I feel like there's bad, and it's getting like amplified in a way that it hasn't in the past. So I'm setting aside trying to figure out this feelings piece. And what I'm writing today, and I got totally clobbered when I tried to tweet about this last week, so I'm backing up and writing a post, is that most Americans are financially better off than before the pandemic.
Yep.
So I'm now going to just the data, the spending, inflation adjusted. So I'm just trying to make the case, because I'm like, and somebody was like, I think people just interpret the question different. When you ask them, are you financially better off, they kind of have this feeling of how do I feel, and there's inflation and I'm worried. And I'm like, that's fine. But when I see, are you financially better off, I think of wealth and spending and income. So I'm trying to do my part but it's tough. I mean, if you say anything good about the economy, and again, I don't do it for the politics, you just like it's kind of overwhelming, like how much anger.
Well, I'll just chime in. I mean, we've been overweight equity since December. We've been saying there's no recession coming. I mean, believe me, we know. I know what you're talking about, because I get just skewered on social media for saying things aren't as bad as you think they are. We call this is facts versus feelings.
Yeah,
right?
no, I saw that in the name.
There's a feelings part to everything, of course, but there's also the facts part. And we try our best to kind of combine those two things in this podcast. And I just want to say thank you, Claudia, for taking a lot of time with Sonu and myself, everyone from the Carson Group in general. This was an awesome discussion. We appreciate it, and also like the fact that you've got kind of a positive view on the world, as we just laid out. Now, one final thing, where can people follow you and learn a little bit more about the research you're doing?
So the best place to follow me would be on my Substack. So Stay at Home Macro Sahm. That's where I do most of my longer writing. I write at Bloomberg Opinion if you're on Bloomberg. I do about weekly. And then I am kind of on Twitter. Like it's a love-hate relationship right now. But there I am at Claudia_Sahm.
Okay.
So.
Perfect. Well, definitely, definitely listeners should check out the stuff Saudi. I am just exhausted. Claudia is doing. I'm sorry, I want to talk to you for almost an hour. What Claudia is up to. So with that, we are going to sign off. Hopefully, everybody hasn't. By the time you listen to this, maybe Thanksgiving's happened, maybe it hasn't. But we want to wish everyone an awesome and happy Thanksgiving. Hopefully, everybody gets a couple days off of work and just life in general, and hang out and watch some football, eat some food, hang out with family, or just do whatever you want to do, right? Just lay around and take a nap. I mean, whatever. It's your day. Hopefully everyone gets to do that. And Sonu, I mean, I know you and I will talk before, but looking forward to hearing the update. I know the podcast listeners looking forward to hearing the update of your travels to Jamaica and all the fun that
Fingers
entails.
crossed.
So there we go. Exactly. Fingers crossed. So we'll see everybody next time. Thank you again, Claudia, for joining us on Facts versus Feelings.
Thank you, Claudia.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah,
Happy Thanksgiving. Goodbye.
Information provided on Facts versus Feelings with Sonu Varghese and Ryan Detrick are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. The statements and opinions of show guests may not be reflective of CWM LLC or its affiliates. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial or tax advisor prior to investing. Guests on Facts versus Feelings are not affiliated with CWM LLC.